Welcome to the program that celebrates the people who make the eats and drinks you love. I'm Jim White. With us on today's show, one of our favorite chefs and the guy who makes the best breakfast around in Dallas-Fort Worth, Chef Tom Fleming, along with us from Crossroads Diner.
Morning, Jim.
Can't wait to get with you, Chef, and hear about those award-winning biscuits and all the other great breakfast specialties. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
All right. And as always, our guest gourmet, special introduction to my good friend and one of the finest people I've ever known in my entire life, Mr. Troy Dungan, is along with us.
My goodness, thank you very much, Jim. What a nice introduction.
Well,
it's a pleasure to be here with you, especially with Tom. Tom's in my neck of the woods. I live near Hillcrest and Arapahoe, and he's up on Campbell, pretty close to Preston, so it's an easy trip over there. And not only does he have the best biscuits, he's got some cinnamon rolls that are probably a violation of the Geneva Convention.
Sticky
Those things
bun.
are huge, aren't
Those
they?
sticky buns are phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
And you're only like 2 lights and a left away from me, Troy.
Oh, I know it. I know it.
Yeah.
I'm there, man.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get to it all. Troy, I asked you on the program because you were one of our very favorite guests when we did the old restaurant show on 1080 KRLD for many years, because you and your beautiful wife, Janet, love to travel.
We do.
And because you travel, I'm convinced that the main reason people travel is because they love food and wine. And you always know the best places anywhere in the world for people when they're traveling to eat or drink.
Well, at least to our taste. We like mom and pop hotels, not the big U.S. hotels, which you might as well be in the U.S. Small hotels, and then you don't have to eat expensively in Europe because there are places that are good values. It's kind of like wine. The game is find something you really like that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. My uncle used to come over to my house and say, I brought some wine. It's not expensive enough to be bad. And, there is something to that.
Exactly.
So, yes, we love to do that. And, we have some favorites. And I'm threatening to write another book called Cheap Hotels, Expensive Bars. But my wife said I can't really do that. But Cheap Hotels, Expensive Bars is what it's all about.
Well, we're going to devote an entire segment to you during this month that you've decided to, I decided, and you were gracious enough to accept.
Thank you, yes.
To be our guest gourmet, Mr. Troy Dungan, along with us throughout the month for these next 4 episodes to talk about great travel dining opportunities and great neighborhood restaurants. You know some of the best BYOB restaurants in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
I do. First of all, we mentioned Tom's Place, which is hop, skip, and a jump for me. But I'll just give you a little teaser. And Tom, I don't know if you know about this guy, but there's a restaurant right around the corner from me called Dal Testardo, which roughly translated in Italian means the stubborn one. And my tease is that the Chef Venezio's from Calabria, on the tip of the Italian boot. But on his way here, he spent a little while in the kitchens of the Vatican cooking for Pope John Paul II.
My goodness.
This is not a bad credential, right? And he says he was not only a good pope, he was a good man. So that's right around the corner for me. We can talk about that later.
Okay, that's great. Troy Dungan, our guest gourmet on Wining and Dining with Jim White, who also has a new book, which we need to plug. And you're going to love this. It's full of great humor, just as you've always experienced from Troy through the year. Good, solid information, but good humor, too. Jesus Makes Salsa by the Seashore. And especially if you haven't read John 21, or you don't remember what that is, you're going to love this book and other segments.
Well, Tom, being a restaurateur, will appreciate this because Chapter 1, Jesus Makes Salsa by the Seashore, does have to do with Jesus invented fish tacos. I don't know if you know this, but he did, and we'll get to that at some point. But
So
hey,
you're referring to the loaves and fishes?
No,
This was Breakfast by the Sea, and it's a fairly long story, but it's a good Bible study, but it's got some humor in it as well. If God doesn't have a sense of humor, I'm done.
I think we all are.
But hey, we've got a chef here. We need to get this guy on and talk about his place. Huh?
A real chef, indeed. Crossroads Diner. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say it's just everybody's go-to best breakfast anywhere. You also serve lunch. Mm-hmm. And what about those award-winning biscuits that we teased with?
Well, the biscuits are just part of the whole the whole thing that attracts people to Crossroads, because it's handmade. We make everything in-house, jellies, jams, the biscuits. And my philosophy is, and I learned this from a great chef who I worked for 7 years, John Joho in Chicago. And his philosophy was, what is good today is not good for tomorrow. And he was always challenging us, and it taught me to constantly challenge myself, my team. Hey, we did great today. How can we make it better? How do we impact the guests' breakfast, their experience with us? How do we make it better? Because the restaurant business can become very monotonous over time. And I've always been drawn to the restaurant business from a young age because no 2 days are alike. And so if I find that we keep challenging ourselves and the team keeps challenging ourselves, it makes the day go better, and the guests just love it.
Well, absolutely true. Well, you mentioned something very interesting, and I wanted to get to your background because people in the know, the chefs in the culinary community, they know your background. They understand the amazing classical training and experiences you've had. But it may strike some as strange that a classically trained chef would be doing a place with diner in the name. Talk a little bit about that transition. And I know you had been at the Riviera and other fine restaurants here in Dallas that folks may remember. But how did this whole concept of Crossroads Diner come about for you, and why?
It comes from the fact that I'm a morning person, always been a morning person. And that doesn't really jive well when you're working fine dining and working till midnight, 5-6 nights a week, and then all of a sudden, without even an alarm clock, it's 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm up. It doesn't matter. Now it's about 4:30, but that's another story. So being a morning person, I would always want to go get something to eat, and I wake up hungry. I love breakfast. I've always been a breakfast guy, so I've been to every place. So kind of came to the Crossroads, and that's kind of helped, between that and my love of Eric Clapton's music and being at a Crossroads professionally in my life, I took what I had been doing, and that was just, an homage to classic French training when I first started, and then working with new American products and all that, and the fact that I'm a morning guy and I love breakfast, and just decided, you know what? I think this is the best use of my God-given talents, quite frankly. I had 2 young daughters at that time. So I was, the good thing about being a morning guy is I'm up in the morning and I'm getting them ready for school while my wife was, sleeping in because she had them all day. And so I kind of took that idea of, well, if I'm up, I might as well do what I'm passionate about. And that's breakfast and taking care of good people, but cooking great quality food. So I said, why don't I take what I've learned all these years in fine dining, and that is a commitment to the highest quality, made in-house. We're going to put the best possible product in front of the guests, but let's do it from 7 to 2 so that way I can be home with my daughters at night and be involved in their lives, and it's worked out well.
So you're up early, but you get to go home and spend time with family, which in the restaurant business is unheard of.
It is.
I mean, in your other jobs, you probably got home sometimes 2, 3 in the morning.
Oh, and then back up at 6 o'clock sometimes, and I'd get my kids off to school.
Yep.
And I don't know much about real estate, but I bought a house in Richardson. I've lived there for 20 plus years. It's the bus stop. I'm at a corner street. It's the bus stop for elementary, junior high, high school. So my trek to get my kids on the bus was really walking down the front sidewalk. So I'm very fortunate that way. But you're right. Get home at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I got to be back by 9 o'clock in the morning. I got a meeting. I got to get ready for lunch service. And so it just got very grinding, for lack of a better word, Troy. And now I'm closed at 2. I can be involved. This past couple years, I've been helping my daughter. She plays softball, so I was coach of the team and enjoyed that. And I get to hang out with my other daughter. And so over time, though, the funny thing is that I wanted to be close and be home and make dinner, be around the family, which has been a godsend. But now I got teenage daughters. And they got about as much time for their old man as, with their hand out, a little eye roll and the whole thing, like, I've had enough of you. So it's been an interesting dynamic in how the relationship grows and how you're involved in your kids' lives. So, but again, it still comes back to great quality food, making my guests happy, welcoming them, and I love that.
And that speaks to the name Diner. this is, if you haven't been there, folks, it's not one of those reworked streetcars with aluminum siding like in South Philly.
Right.
This is a nice, big, bright, open restaurant. But diner, that speaks to the fact that it's just good quality hometown cooked food.
Right. And when diners were, first came around in this country, it was always scratch cooking, and so then over time it kind of got into more of a homogenous thing. But I wanted to really create something that, good quality food that was approachable to everybody. And that has always been, I learned that from John Joho. I mean, it's a 4-star restaurant that's been there for 30 years. His philosophy is that we pair the humble and the noble, but it's always approachable. Nobody wants to sit at a table in a fine dining restaurant and look at the person next to them, and you know this, and you know this well. What the heck is this right here? I don't know what that is. What is that? And he taught me that from the very beginning. We take the simplest of products. We do the minimalist possible to really execute their great flavors and pair them properly, and then it creates, it just makes the experience for our guests that much better, because it's like, I've never known a turnip could taste this good, right? Right, and it goes well with foie gras. Who knew that? And some great Gewürztraminer reduction sauce. So it was that very simplistic approach that he's always had that I have kind of made my way with, that has worked really well. I mean, it doesn't sound sexy, but I make a great breakfast sausage, and I make great chorizo. And my quiche, I learned how to make quiche in the kitchens of Paul Bocuse. And so, it's the most simplistic way of preparing food that usually works the best. It's kind of in life. When you start overthinking it and you start getting in the way of yourself, you tend to screw it up.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Tom, let's talk a little bit about that journey from Bocuse to Joho and to Dallas. Now, you're from the Milwaukee area originally.
Chicago.
Okay.
Suburbs of Chicago.
Which suburb?
Elk Grove Village.
I know Elk Grove. I spent 3 or 4 years in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I thought it was Wisconsin. That's why I wanted to ask you, though. So what was it like for a kid from the suburbs of Chicago coming back and working with one of the top chefs anywhere in the world?
I'll tell you, my training really started at my mother's apron strings. She and my father got married right after World War II. My father was a vet. And like a lot of returning vets, they had come back and had tasted foods of Europe. I mean, they came off of farms and out of tenement projects and were sent over to Europe. And, obviously they ate army chow, but they also had an experience with European food. And so there was a demand for that from returning vets. My mother, my grandmother, my great aunt, and my other aunt all went to the same cooking school in Chicago in the early 1950s, run by a husband and wife, Francois and Antoinette Pope, School of Cooking. And they did sauce work, meat, all kinds of classical French cooking. And so that's what my mother cooked when I was growing up. She was feeding 7 people, and we ate lots of bistro fare. We ate poulet roti, roast chicken, rice pilaf, roasted vegetables. And so that's where I kind of got my taste of...
No hamburger helper at your house.
No. There was none of that in my house. I mean, it was a scratch kitchen. And my mother taught me, the basics of French cooking and pastry making. She taught me cost control. She taught me how to reutilize products and make something else. So those fundamentals of, professional cooking, I started at 9. And it's just kind of, I've always loved it. My mom always told me, the restaurant business is a very hard business, but you'll never leave the kitchen hungry. So you're going to get at least one meal a day. And so that kind of just morphed. Came home from school one summer. I was a sophomore in high school. My father says, "What's your plans for the summer?" And I was thinking, in my back of my mind, I was just thinking, I'm just going to blow off this summer and hang out. He had other ideas. The last thing he said to me at breakfast that morning was, "Don't come home without a job." So I got a job at McDonald's. And so that was my first job. Fast forward, I was later in high school. I needed to work. And I have a sibling who's in the restaurant business, and he was running back then, a continental fine dining restaurant in San Antonio. And I needed work, and he needed a dishwasher. And it was an incredible moment, the moment I walked into that kitchen. I had never been in a professional kitchen before, but the sights, the smells, the sounds, the energy, it was like a moth to a light. And I have never left the kitchen since then. It was incredible just to walk in and your olfactory senses are just completely blown away by the smells of veal stock and chicken stock and things being cooked and roasted. And literally it's just like, whoa, what is this? And I have been in the kitchen since, and I have always, I wanted to reach a certain level of profession in my profession. I figured, you know what, and I'm a big history buff, I've always have been. So I figured, you know what, if I really learn the root and the classics of fine cooking, and I naturally gravitated towards French and Mediterranean style because that's what, I grew up in my first kitchen in my mom's house.
Sure.
I just said, you know what, I'm going to do this as an apprenticeship. This is a trade. We work with our hands. Chefs are tradesmen. We always have been. And so I'm going to go the old world way and learn it the right way. And so, I went about on about a 10-year plan, and I went to culinary school outside Chicago at Kendall College, knowing that I was going to work for John Joho. I had seen pictures and read articles about him, and visually it looked great, and I was just like, I just want to know how that's done. Got to school, got an apprenticeship worth them, and a funny story, I know we're short on time. You ever remember the show Cheers?
Yeah.
There's one episode where Norm actually goes out to interview for a job. He comes into the bar, everybody's, Norm! And he's got a suit coat on, and you've never seen him in the show in a suit coat. And everybody's, how'd the interview go? Oh, it was great. I aced it, blah, 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 blah. All right, get some beer. And he takes off his jacket, and everything that isn't covered is dry, but then everything else is completely soaking wet from sweat. That is exactly what happened to me when I interviewed with John Joho. I mean, I went to this thing. I was so nervous that by the time I got out of there, got back on the L train to head up to Evanston, my suit was almost completely soaked because I was so nervous to be in the presence of greatness in my mind, and he is, that I couldn't believe that he actually hired me. So fast forward, I spent time with him on my internship. And while I was in my internship, Paul Bocuse came to Chicago, and he and Champagne Mum started this scholarship, Culinary Excellence. And the first contest to get it was at Kendall College. I was in the room when he was there and announced it. And I literally said to myself, I'm winning this. I am going to win this.
Good for you.
I went back to work that afternoon at the Everest on my externship, and Paul Bocuse happened to be having lunch there. Actually, there's a picture at my restaurant up by the cashier where from the kitchen of the Everest after Paul Bocuse had lunch with all the cooks. So he leaves, and John Joho says, what'd you think about this? And I literally said to him that day, I said, I'm winning that. I'm going to win that, and I'm going to go work for him. And then I'm going to work in France and then come back and work for you. He says, then do it. And I did it. And it was a great experience to go there. Not only did I get to spend time in the kitchens at Paul Bocuse, I got to go to the Champagne region, work in some Michelin-starred restaurants in Reims and Epernay. And as great as Paul Bocuse was, then I was able to go work at another 3-star Michelin restaurant that John Joho actually apprenticed at, and he got me the job there with the Aberlin family at Aubergille up in the Alsace region. And what an incredible experience that was. And so after that, came back, and then I spent 7 years learning the craft from my mentor, John Joho. 5 years at the Everest, working every station, mastering everything that I could. And then he decided that with his partners at Let Us Entertain You to open Brasserie Joe, and I was tapped to be the chef. So I went from doing all this fine dining, and then I got it right back into the classics of bistro cooking, which really was kind of like, well, now I'm back cooking the food my mom taught me how to make. And
you took that restaurant to a James Beard nomination, right?
The team won Best New Restaurant from James Beard Foundation in 1996 when we opened. Yep. And
so then that was at about the point when this whole wonderful Dallas episode to our great treasure brought you here. But what was the conversation like with Jean when you went to him and said, how did that come about? I mean,
it was actually, I opened Brasserie Joe, wildly famous. I know we're on television, but I worked my ass off. I mean, I was in the kitchen.
Digital TV, my friend.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. I was in the kitchen at 6 a.m, leaving the kitchen 11 o'clock. I was just newly married right after we opened. And, I was just constantly working. I was just getting burnt out. And for any chef to spend a lot of time with a mentor, well, over time, the growing stops. And it's not a bad thing, but you have to challenge yourself to learn new things and push yourself to learn new things. And it was very hard. I cried. I mean, we were out on the back alley talking, and I just said, hey, you know what, chef, it's time for me to go. It was a lot of things. I loved growing up in Chicago during the winters and snow forts and sledding and all that, but as an adult, it absolutely is horrible. I was ready to get out of the city. I was ready to come back to Texas. My bride was ready for a new thing. So it kind of just all came to fruition.
Now, is it David Holben who got you here originally, or?
Well, no, I originally came to open Aquinox for Stephen Piles.
Oh, it was Stephen. Okay.
Yep. And I came down here. I tasted for him. He offered me the job. I moved down. He was having some construction delays. My wife was working. She'd come home, and I'm an out-of-work chef. And so I'd get in a lot of looks of disdain, like, hey, man, get your ass a job. And so I
don't come home without a job.
Not the first time. So I started reaching out to some chef friends of mine back in Chicago, if they knew anybody. And in the chef world, it's a very tight community. And I had known not only Stephen, but I knew Dean Faring from working with John Joho and their friends and have met him. I reached out to Dean. He's like, my kitchen's full. Do you know anybody? He goes, a friend of mine named David Holben is opening a new restaurant. He's moving his chef there, David Woodward, and they need a replacement for him at their original location at Preston and Campbell, which is kind of interesting because I've come full circle. I'm less than, a mile from where it all started for me. And so I went and met David Holben, and we interviewed. I tasted with him. He was very happy. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to get back to you. I'm actually going to be leaving tomorrow morning. I got to do a charity event in Cincinnati. So I'll be back in town on Monday. Let's talk Tuesday afternoon. Okay, sounds great. Thanks, chef. Well, he goes to this event, and I didn't even know some buddies of mine from Chicago who are chefs would be at that event. I didn't know they partook in it. I had never heard of this event. Anyways, so long story short, he goes to the event. He's talking with some chef friends of mine from Chicago, Dean Zanella, John Hogan, another chef I knew who has since passed. And they were talking about, what's going on? What are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. And he said, he goes to my friend John Hogan, who's the chef at River Roast in Chicago. He works with Tony Montuano. And he says, hey, do you know a guy? He just moved to Dallas by the name of Tom Fleming. And John Hogan was the chef de cuisine at the Everest when I first started there. And we've been friends and colleagues since day one. And John Hogan looks at David Holben and says, if you don't hire him, you're an effing idiot.
That's a pretty good endorsement.
So David calls me and gets back and calls me. We sit down because I was living over by Toscana because I lived close to where the Aquinox was going to be. And so we sit down and talk, and he goes, so I found out a lot about you this week. And I'm like, okay. Well, this event, there's different chefs from Chicago. I'm like, okay. He goes through the litany of names. Yes, I know all these guys very well. And he relays what John Hogan had told him. And so I started with David Holben. Started a week later with David Holben, and we have been great friends. He's a great chef. I have learned so much from that guy. I probably have forgotten more than I can remember that he's taught me. I mean, and we have very similar paths to where we have gone. And so I spent time there, went to the Riviera. I mean, Franco was one of the owners of the Mediterraneo. So I spent 18 months there and really got to know Franco too. And then the position to be the chef at the Riviera opened up, and I was absolutely. So and then it just kind of went down the road. I mean,
great heyday in Dallas restaurants. Yes,
great history, but what impresses me sitting here talking with Tom is you have to have talent and ability, but what I see and hear here is passion. Mm-hmm. Passion is what makes it work, and especially if you're talking about being in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. I can see the wheels turning up there. You love what you do.
I do, and I people ask me, how do you do it? It's such a hard business. It's such a risk. All that. And I've always been an introspective person. And so there's in everybody's careers, you guys, just like me, there's ebbs and flows. And you're like, okay, why am I doing this? And you have to remind yourself what it is that got you into it. I've always had a very strong olfactory senses, the smells. My daughter is an equestrian rider. I can't get near a horse barn because the smell of horse crap just is like a mule kick to the face. But she loves it, and I support her dream of doing that. But the smells every day, I love that. And I like making people happy. And so I'm just kind of bringing it down to the most basic things. I love great food. I love the smells. I love the taste. I love the fact that everything is different every day as far as the experience. But most importantly, at the end of the day, I make people happy. So it's, if I can just do that and keep out of the way of myself, then I happily get up at 4:30 every morning and go do it again.
You say I have a sibling in the business. Now, what about your kids? Any interest in following in Dad's footsteps?
My youngest daughter likes to cook, but she really, and actually both my children actually work in the restaurant on weekends. Mm-hmm. My youngest daughter likes to cook. She likes the kitchen. She's more introverted. Doesn't like, pardon me, stranger, customers are in the dining room, see her and stop her and like, oh, you're the chef's daughter. And all of a sudden in her mind, she's like, why are you talking to me? And
You're supposed to be eating and paying your bill.
Exactly. Come on, we got to turn this table. Let's go. And my oldest daughter is very extroverted, and she actually just started waiting some tables this summer to make some money, and she loves it too. But I've always told them that, because I kind of grew up with the philosophy that whatever your passion and your dream is, chase it. But you better have a plan B.
Tom, I'm sorry. Let's do something practical. Let's tell people, unlike Troy and I, who have been to Crossroads Diner, exactly where you're located, because I want people who haven't found you to come and find you.
We're at the northeast corner of Preston and Campbell in the Preston Trail Shopping Center. There's a big Kroger there. And we're on the Campbell Road side. It used to be an old Hallmark store, and you can't miss it.
And so you started out, of course, your original claim to fame in the diner business was at another Crossroads, a fairly major one of Central and Walnut Hill.
Yep.
What was it like having to uproot and move north?
It was an emotional roller coaster because it kind of, and for me, I don't mind talking about it. I find it cathartic just to let it out and move past it. It was that building. I had bird dog for 5 years. I love that building. I love Art Deco style buildings. And I thought its proximity to Presbyterian, I had 2 daughters were born there and I couldn't find any food to feed my wife. So that whole process, it was physically exhausting trying to move a restaurant with my team. It was emotionally a kick in the crotch because I love that building, and for it to be taken away because of developers wanted to do something different, I just didn't understand their philosophy. I still don't, but you know what? I wish them nothing but the worst of luck, and I say that half-heartedly. So it was the toughest thing I've ever done in my professional career, to move a restaurant and reopen in 10 days.
But you have bounced back beautifully, and people just love your restaurant. Give us the hours so people, what time can they join you for breakfast? And
7 a.m. to 2 p.m.
Okay.
Tuesday through Sunday. We're always closed on Mondays because I like to think that the stoves need a day off too.
Exactly.
And of course, now that I have teenage daughters and I wanted to be home at night, now they're like, yeah, dude, we got stuff going on, Dad. Whatever. Just, we're good. We'll rent the place out at night for private events. I mean, we just did a 50th wedding anniversary for 125 people on Saturday night. So
that is perfect. And one quick thing, you and I have had a conversation about Escoffier's thought about cooking an egg.
Mm-hmm.
And you have told me that he said that it was the most difficult dish to prepare correctly.
Yep.
Can you give our viewers/listeners any tips on cooking an egg other than coming to see
So if you want to cook an egg, you cook an egg in a I do it in a Teflon pan at a low heat. But what you do is you put a little bit of butter in it
mm-hmm.
and melt it very slow so the pan is not too hot, because you don't want the whites to blister. When the whites blister, all the water, which it's a majority of water in the whites, blisters and it then becomes dry. So I always start my pan. I use a little bit of clarified butter. The pan is cold. I put 2 eggs into it and I turn it on a low flame and I let it start to come up slowly, because when you let it come up slowly, the whites will solidify, retaining a lot more of the natural water that is in there. So that way, when you bite into it, the whites then actually dissipate on your tongue into your palate, as opposed to it being kind of that chewy, rubbery kind of thing, because the white got blistered and you've released all the water.
That's perfect. Tom, thank you. And I do recommend folks that you go see Tom and have him do it for you at Crossroads Diner.
Absolutely, every morning except Mondays.
Yeah. Thank you, my friend. It's always good to see
My
you.
pleasure, guys. Great to be with
Our
you.
very best to the beautiful Karen Fleming
Mm-hmm.
and your lovely daughters.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us here.
My fun. My fun.
Mr. Troy, thank you for being along with us here as our guest gourmet.
What fun sitting there with Tom. My goodness. And once again, talking about cooking the egg. Passion once again.
Exactly.
I love it.
Now, we haven't run you off, have you? You're going to stay with us for all 4 episodes?
Oh, I'll be here all month.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Troy. And our thanks to Tom Fleming for being with us on the show. I'm Jim White, and I want to remind you, if anybody asks what you're making for dinner, tell them reservations.